So you're 21 years old at this time?
Yeah.
And you get invited to a meeting to meet a friend, and all of a sudden the friend is Bill Gates.
It's tricky. I like to put myself in situations that I would consider impossible. At that point, I have no choice. 700 dinners, 1,500 conversations where you repeatedly go, it's going to work. And sometimes you don't know whether it will work or not, but you kind of have to say that it will. Because if you're not the one who's going to believe in it, no one will. I think the journey as a founder is always a tricky one. You're always learning. 2020 with 30 people, 2022 with 300. I want the world to look and feel and work a certain way. If no one else is going to do it for you, you might as well step up and do it.
You're 28 years old, your Surge has 400 plus employees, you work exceptionally hard. And I can see there's a certain drive in you that's unusual. And so I'd love to kind of unpack, what is that, do you think?
2019 was also then a bit of a tricky year for Sri Lanka. We had a terrorist attack. The meeting was at the Shangri-La. As I pull in, you see the front face completely explode. Second explosion, I see a woman's hand flying off. 200 and something people died that day. That was probably something that changed my perspective a bit.
How? Welcome to Chew the Fat. I'm absolutely obsessed with high performance and business. So I sit down with incredible guests and we talk about what it takes to be at the top. This is part of my mission to raise $1 million for children's cancer by running a cookbook called Eat with Purpose. I've got one ask for you. Share the content. The bigger the audience, the bigger the impact. Let's get stuck in. Bhanuka, CEO and founder of Surge, welcome to Chew the Fat.
Thank you for having me.
Where I'd love to start is boil down some key moments for me in your childhood. What's made the person you are today?
Oh man, my childhood is an interesting one. I come from a typical South Asian kind of academic household. Mom's a doctor, dad's a doctor, brother's a doctor, brother married a doctor whose sister is a doctor. Weirdly, I married a doctor whose sister is a doctor. So I studied to be a doctor. We had a very kind of strict learning environment. Your Asian dad beating you because you didn't get the calculations right is kind of where we grew up with. In Sri Lanka, we have two types of exams. We have our ordinary levels and our advanced levels. My brother got 9 A's and 1 B. And because he got a 1B, every time my parents would tell his results to anyone else, they'd say he failed. So just to give a bit of context, right? It was a fun environment, I would say, in its own way. I grew up actually in Australia for a small bit. When I was 5, my dad did his, I think his PhD, or not PhD, I think for his postgrad in Sydney and Melbourne. So from ages 5 to 7, I lived in Australia, which is partly why I have a weirded out accent. And I think that was probably the beginning of the journey for me because it changed the way we saw the world. It gave us a lot of exposure around everything that's happening from video games to the world around us, so that when we came back home, I could never really fit in because what I wanted to do and what I was exposed to in my peer groups here in Colombo were really not the same. Essentially, it kind of built my love for video games, which I have to date. And that's kind of how we grew up. We played Pokemon. It was usually my brother and his Nintendo 64 playing and I watching, and we kind of built that over time. And that's really even Surge. Before it became Surge, it was essentially a video games business, right? We had a MCN, a multi-channel network, where we figured out we could make money playing video games. And we had published this content, made a little bit of money. This was over 10 years ago, I think about 13 years ago when I got started in that game called, we started a channel called TheGamersCottage, published a whole bunch of content, realized you could make a little bit of money, and being an 18-year-old in Sri Lanka, making a bit of money playing video games, you are living life peak, right? So that's kind of a little bit of an insight into my childhood. I was a very big kid from grade 6, 7, 8. I crossed 100 kilos. When I was sitting for my advanced level exams, I was 130 kilos.
What was that like in comparison to the peers and the people, of your friends at the time?
I mean, significantly heavier. It corners you out a bit because you can't really participate in the things that all your friends are doing because you're tired all the time. But it's very little social activity. We went to an all boys school called Ananda, and it's tricky. There's a ton of bullying. There's a ton of, well, like any school, right? But this is kind of why video games became my outlet, because the friends that I made online are everyone from this like 42-year-old dude in Albania to a 16-year-old in Manila, and they don't really care about who you are and what you look like, and you could build really strong, long-lasting relationships. I had my wedding a couple weeks ago, and we literally had people that I played video games with 13 years ago from Nigeria would fly in for the wedding.
Wow.
So it's really interesting to see this come back full circle, but I think that's kind of a bit of context around how the early days look like.
One of the important things I want to dive into before we get into the journey is what drives you. And I think, from hearing from you about that household and how you were brought up and being pushed to, consider one be a failure, is there something in there with regards to the bullying and stuff that also drove you? Or what are the key things that, because I met you in Necker Island about a year and a half ago, and from that moment till today, you work exceptionally hard. And I can see there's a certain drive in you that's unusual. And so I'd love to kind of unpack, what is that, do you think?
I honestly don't know. I think there's different phases of it, right? Initially, I like to put myself in situations that I would consider impossible. At that point, I have no choice. When I decided to go all in on video games, I burnt all my bridges in a path to medicine. So you had to be successful. After that, I got diagnosed with a pretty rare arthritic condition called ankylosing spondylitis. It's an autoimmune disease. And the medication that I had to take for it was phenomenally expensive. It was in Sri Lankan terms about 80,000 rupees, which is probably about $200 US per vial. However, the vial was per 20 kilograms of body weight. So for me, at one point, I had to spend something like $2,000 at the time to basically stay alive. And the frequency of the dosage was so high that I was getting the treatment, which is a biologics injection, every month. It didn't get covered under like standard medical coverage because it requires cold chain storage from the point of manufacturing to being brought here. It was just really expensive. And I noticed that majority of my parents' savings would go directly into what is essentially keeping me alive. At that point, you kind of take a look at yourself and say, look, you need to do something. Happened in two parts. One, about your health, and two, you need to make significantly larger quantums of money than you've been making before.
Wow. Okay. Oh, okay. Bhanuka, I am, usually when I have these conversations for Chew the Fat, we try and condense the journey into, a couple of minutes or 10 minutes because we're all about the lessons learned. But I think, given where you are, you're 28 years old, your Surge has 400 plus employees, you span across multiple businesses, and you're from a country, Sri Lanka, that, that's not that common. And so I think it's really important to kind of unpick and kind of dive deep into your journey, because not only do I think from the audience perspective, there's these incredible insights that are going to be learned, but as well as inspiration. And so bring me to the start. You talked about there, Surge started as a video gaming company. Like, bring me through that journey and let's start kind of unpacking it.
All right. Whew, okay. I was studying for my A-levels, biology, physics, and chemistry. I found it phenomenally boring, and I decided to make it more interesting, and I started a online school. I don't think anyone knows this properly because I don't really talk about this. I started a business, so to speak, called Lankan Tutor. Basically, the syllabus that we had for biology, physics, and chemistry, as I was doing it, I was recording it, editing it, putting it up on YouTube. The channel's still all out there. Really low quality videos, but if you've seen stuff like Khan Academy, I wanted to create something like that existed to the local syllabus because it didn't really correlate. I didn't have a business model. The idea was, oh, this is a good cause. I'm sure people would donate to it. Over the next year and a half, I think we made a couple hundred videos. I got $150 from donations, none of which came from Sri Lankans. It was all like random people in different parts of the world that are like, oh, this is kind of cool, let me donate. That was probably my first foray into trying to do something of commercial value. After a while, I realized, look, I am doing this for my passion in building content in YouTube, not because I really enjoy biology, physics, and chemistry. Ended up going all in on a YouTube channel. I started this thing, I had my personal channel, but I also started this network called TheGamersCottage. I had gotten a part of an ad network, an agency called TGN back in the day, which then they got acquired by Broadband TV and all of these things. They were essentially a network for markets in South Asia to get monetization enabled because YouTube did not have it. What we did was I met one of the founders. I was probably about 15 at the time. When I say met, I mean I DM'd them on YouTube.
Yeah, right. That's a super interesting take. Are you eating right now? Do you want to eat better? Chew the Fat podcast is brought to you by the Eat with Purpose cookbook. It's available now, and it's part of my mission to raise $1 million for children's cancer. Get it from eatwithpurpose.net, and I want you to let me know when you're snacking, because you'd be snacking good. Let's get back to the show.
Back when a lot of people would DM people on YouTube. And he said, yeah, sure, look, we'll make you a partner. You can go out and drive revenue through affiliate sales and all of that. And I was like, oh, this seems like it makes sense. So I started a group channel. I called it TheGamersCottage. And I would look for South Asian emerging content creators that would play League of Legends, Minecraft, all of these stuff. And we would post about it and help them increase their view count, help them generate revenue, and we would make a percentage of the revenue that they generated. And that was the first business.
How old are you at this time?
I was probably about 17, 18. Yeah. I started on pretty early.
I love it.
Because I think I was about 16 when I started started Lankan Tutor.
Yeah.
Once we did that, I realized, okay, the more people that you had on your network, kind of the views that you got compounded over time. And at one point, we had about 600 content creators generating 60 million views a month. That sounds like a lot of money. It's not. It really just boils down to once you pay everyone and the revenue shares, it's about $1,000, $2,000 a month US. So that's about 3 Aussie. But if you are an 18-year-old living in a country like Sri Lanka, you are balling. This was the same time I was sitting for my advanced level exams. Naturally, the year I sat for my exams, and this is STEM, Sri Lankan government education is insanely competitive. Sitting for that exam and making 400 videos in the same year means you sacrifice on something, right? And it wasn't sleep, it was the exam. I would go to school, come back home, make videos throughout the night, go to school again, and then sleep in school.
Yeah, right.
The teachers obviously hated it, but I think it worked out for the best, look in hindsight. Until my exam results came, right? Like I said, my parents are incredibly academic. My mom was the first female oral and maxillofacial surgeon to come out of Sri Lanka. My dad's comes from a really rural background. His parents were farmers. His mom was illiterate. She couldn't read or write. And he essentially ended up becoming a consultant psychiatrist, a professor, and he's incredibly academically gifted. And then for your kids to go, oh, I'm just going to get out of school, he viewed it as a kind of a deviating from what will help you succeed, because he's seen what his parents went through, and I understand, and his siblings who didn't follow academia, who didn't get to do as well as he did in life. So it was a tough one for him to reconcile with. And what ended up happening with the results is, naturally, I got really shitty marks, and they lost it, right? There was a certain period of my time post that they would, like my dad specifically, just wouldn't talk to us.
Wow.
Um,
How did that feel in the moment?
I was a very stubborn kid, right? And I think, and as an entrepreneur, you need that.
Yeah.
The saving grace was even when my brother did his exams, in advanced levels, you get 3 attempts. He didn't make enough marks to get into medicine the first attempt, so he did it a second time. And second time, he got remarkable results, and he got into medicine to be a doctor. And my parents were like, it's fine. You did your first attempt. Do it properly the second time. And if it doesn't work, we'll figure out a way to like send you to Russia so you can do private medical school or something. Like they're very, very set on being a doctor. The real choices that I had was not whether you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, is whether you're going to be a cardiothoracic surgeon, a neurologist, a nephrologist. That was kind of the scope I had to pick from. So to kind of have your kids do something else is really tough. I told my parents, well, rather my mom, that I need an incredibly high performance PC for Lunken Tutor to kind of expand the channel. And they did see me make videos about education and all this stuff. So they thought that I was actually studying. And my mom, bless her heart, she saw the best in us and everything. So my parents are like super different, right? My dad is a little bit on the grumpy, strict side. And one time I remember we were studying for math, and he asked, and this is probably at grade 7, he asked me what 8 times 3 was, and I said 32 repeatedly. And he got so frustrated, like he threw a porcelain plate at me, right? So just kind of give you context on this. So my mom ended up buying that computer for us, for me, and that was really when I had the ability to turn things to overdrive. I could produce content much faster. We don't think about it today, but if you tried exporting a video 10 years ago, you're waiting 16 hours for the video to export, and then another 8 hours for it to upload on YouTube, because we didn't have good internet connections, right? These are things that a creator today would not understand. So I could now suddenly hit export, and the video would process in an hour. And to me, that was like amazing, right? And these aren't like super high quality videos. This is like standard 720p, 1080p pieces of content, but they're 40 minutes long, so it requires things. But the week after I got my results, I had a really traumatic event. YouTube sent a letter saying they're changing their policies. New policies is if you are a part of a network, you are not allowed to have sub-network under you. So, because it started getting complicated, everyone was building their own brands, and it just got a little messy. And they also disabled monetizations for some countries. And they said they're going out of their they're going out of their beta into an official release. And Sri Lanka did not exist in that official.
Yes. And what was the like when you saw that? What was the money coming in and the tap now about to turn off?
$3,000 a month, which was a lot of money, and it wasn't going to reduce; it was going to hit 0.
Yeah.
So it became. You go through kind of the stages of grief. You're initially in denial. You're like, no way, this doesn't make sense. And you start, at the end of it, we were writing letters to YouTube, like, this bunch of kids in Sri Lanka sending letters saying, hey, do this, do that. Obviously, they wouldn't care. And then a month later, you accept it because you are in December, you made $3,000. In January, you make nothing. The tricky part is we hadn't been fiscally responsible because we were kids. Yeah. Every time we made money, we would have spent it. Not in the smartest ways either. And I had started with a friend of mine. I had convinced him to join the business that we had started. He was doing his exams as well, and I convinced him to drop out to a certain extent. And I was like, oh, not only am I tanking my own career, I'm tanking my friends. My friend I met playing League of Legends. And he was, brave enough, in a sense, to continue with me. So what we said was, I didn't want to tell my parents I was wrong and this thing shut down, because they were like, the internet is a fad, it's going to disappear, stay away from it, get back to studying. I was like, no, this is it, this is the future. So we pretended that everything was okay. And then we proceeded to create content like nothing happened. And we could stretch ourselves for about 3 months. Fourth month, things were getting tough because we had no money. And I was calling my friend and saying, look, I can't actually pay you. We need to have a chat with our parents and let them know that things are going to hit the ceiling. Fortunately, we were like, we pushed it back. We'll do it next week. We'll do it next week. And on this Friday, we're like, we're going to do it on Monday. That weekend, we were approached by this media business that said, hey, we know you guys are doing this thing on YouTube. We've heard the stories, all of this stuff. We're not really interested in video games, but can you take over our YouTube channel? And I was like, what do you mean take over your YouTube channel? They said, we need to create content. We're a technology magazine. How much do you want to charge to make 2 videos a week? And I'm like, what do you mean charge to make? Because all this time we were getting compensated based on the view count. And then here's someone saying, I don't really care about your view count. Just produce the content for us and we'll pay. Today, this is like, oh, obviously, right? But back then, I couldn't process it. Thought it was an interesting idea. Shut down the YouTube channel because there's really nothing to shut down. And then went into this. We quoted like something like $600, $800 a month. And the rest was history. Shut down the TheGamersCottage, realized there was a different opportunity here, launched a media business called Search. And the idea was we would go to businesses, help them create YouTube content and help them manage and run their YouTube channels. That was the business. We went to coffee shops, magazines, anyone and everyone we could find, and we could slowly collect a bunch of clients. What we realized was, as we got these clients, they would come to us and say, hey, can you help us with our Facebook ads? What is SEO? Can you do it for us? Can you build a website? For 100% of these things, we would say absolutely. And they would go back home, watch YouTube videos, and see how to do this, and then sell it back to them. To me, that story came full circle because the way I learned how to build a website was how to build your blog website from this guy called Pat Flynn.
Yes.
And that was 10 years ago. And last year, I had the pleasure of working with Pat Flynn. And today, Pat Flynn is a client of Surge.
Oh, so good. What's Pat Flynn's podcast?
It's called Smart Passive Income.
Yeah, that's the one. So, you know what I love about that, Bhanuka? I only just realized at this moment that at probably the exact same time period, you and I, in different parts of the world, listening to the exact same content. That was like literally podcast, one of our early podcasts.
It's funny because Pat Flynn's going to see this video.
Yes, I love that. Shout out to Pat Flynn.
So we realized we had something. And we had, without knowing it, built what is called a digital marketing agency. At the time, we didn't know it, but we started embracing it and said, look, Surge is a digital marketing agency. And we had built it over time. This was starting about 2014 to 17. We had grown from not existing to building a business with, I think, about 10 people. And, that was pretty impressive. My dad then went the other way and said, you know what, I'm going to help you. Our house, my mom's a orthopedic surgeon, so she has a dental clinic. The upstairs, we had a small storage room. He went upstairs and he said, look, we're going to clean this up. We're going to remove all the storage things. And he built a desk where it's kind of wraps around the room so that it can have like 8 seats. And he said, oh, if we ever need more space, we can break this wall and move that way so we can add like 2 more seats. Between that realization and us kind of tanking the results was really tough because I don't think it was my parents' fault. I think the issue is culturally, all your aunts and uncles, no one really understands what you're doing. They keep asking my parents, oh, what's your son doing? They know what to tell about the older one. The younger one, they don't really have anything to say because they don't quite understand, and we didn't quite understand either. So it became this thing where they're like, oh, I can find him a job, I can do this, don't waste him. And it became this really toxic feedback cycle of every time they would go to any event, any gathering, they would bring, like the relatives and friends would bring it up, right? And I think that took a toll on them.
And what about a toll on you? Like, how did you?
It was tough, right? Like I wouldn't say it was easy because I knew I came from a privileged position where I didn't have to pay for rent. I didn't have to worry about putting food on the table. My parents were doctors. In Sri Lanka, that's not really you don't really make any money.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's the salary on a standard doctor per month?
So if it's AUD, you're probably best case at about 1,000.
Wow. Yeah. So your YouTube deliverings were like 3 hours.
Yes, it was. Wow. And at the same time, as you progress in your career as a doctor, when you hit like 40, 50, and then your income starts to increase because you get into private practice and you've built a bit of credibility around your name, and you can probably take that 1,000 and go to 2, 3.
Wow.
But 3 is really crazy high in Sri Lanka. Usually you're at that 2K rate.
Wow.
So it's been an incredibly interesting journey, and I think that it was rough, right? Like I every dinner conversation is, oh, why didn't you deliver, or why didn't something happen, or and they're bringing up different universities I can go to and all of these stuff. In a conversation like this, you cram it down to a sentence, right? But it was like 2 years. Right. And that's 700 dinners, about 1,500 conversations where you repeatedly go, it's going to work. And sometimes you don't know whether it will work or not, but you kind of have to say that it will. Because if you're not the one who's going to believe in it, no one will.
That point you just made there, which is, how you contextualize something in like a podcast or a piece of content, it's 2 minutes of airtime compared to the reality, is so important. I think, because we're in this world of content, and because you hear, 60-second sound bites, and then from the outside in, when someone's thinking about the entrepreneurial journey and they're like, oh, there's tough times and this and that, it's really hard to contextualize that day in and day out feeling. But most important is the feeling of like you're on the precipice, and you never truly know it's going to be successful, right? Always at there, like an end of hindsight, it's like really like, oh, it's kind of obvious, but in that like actual moment, you have no idea.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Like I remember one conversation I had with my dad. He told me that we weren't allowed to use Skype. Do you remember Skype? Because I think someone told him that Facebook was bad and he didn't understand the difference between Facebook and Skype.
I love that. So, bring me to this moment, and I don't know if I'm skipping ahead here, Bhanuka. Yesterday we talked about, there's this moment where a company approaches you for a potential investment.
So we had now slowly built a brand in Sri Lanka for the best kind of digital marketing agency. Wasn't typically that hard either, because I think there weren't many. There's like 5 in the country, and in Colombo at least. We were approached by this company called Tavistock. Tavistock is a large private investment organization, the family office of this billionaire Joe Lewis. And they were looking at making a series of strategic investments in Sri Lanka, covering the chain from hardware to collect data, software to house the data, analytics to kind of forecast from the data, and marketing, then to understand the consumer demand to kind of map that across their entire portfolio. They made acquisitions in all of these things, and they were deciding on which software company to buy. One of the companies that they were kind of discussions with was a company called Calci. Now, Calci was a software company that was run by this guy called Mangala. And Mangala, I met December the year prior, in a place called Jaffna. There was this IT week, and he was one of the guests. I was the guy holding the camera. So I was asking him what to do, and I told him about the journey, what I have been doing, and he said, look, ignore this university nonsense. It doesn't make sense. I get where you're going. Double down on it. I still remember this conversation, and I've been telling Mangala every time I meet him since that's probably bad advice to give a child. And what he says was, he actually doesn't give that advice, and he only gave that advice to me. when Tavistock was approaching him, he was the one who floated the name of, hey, you should look at Surge as well. And I think that conversation changed the trajectory of this business. In 2017, in January, I met Haley. She was the Tavistock representative at the time, and we were having a conversation around, is this an interesting business? I looked very different at that time because I had just started the plan of losing weight. The month before, I was essentially bedridden. I had a massive flare-up with my ankle and I couldn't move. I was on crutches, and that was the entire month. And I met the doctors, and they said, look, you're either going to lose weight or this is not going to end well for you. I had tried losing weight before, obviously not the first time, but that time I decided to really just double down. Spent a month bedridden watching kind of weight loss videos, like learning how to count calories, understanding the macros, got into a smartwatch, bought a bike, and just did as much cardio as possible. And there was a Subway next to our office, which was, they had a roast chicken salad, and without any kind of toppings and condiments, I would eat that and a Diet Coke twice a day, every day for the next 9 months. So January 2017, when these guys approached, I was probably running on the highest dose of motivation I've ever had. First month, I lost about 12 to 14 kilograms. Wow. I was very, very on it.
Yes.
And then every opportunity that I got, I was just running for it, right? I met their managing director at the time, and he was here, and we had a conversation. It was supposed to be a 30-minute introduction. I didn't know who I was speaking to. I didn't, now if you get an introduction, you would do some research, and none of that. I went in blind. What should have been a 30-minute conversation became a 4-hour interrogation of the business, and it ended up saying, this is a terrible business. It's very poorly run. It's totally not worth anyone's time. And I think that one hit me a bit hard because firstly, I was like, we were profitable. Not very, but we were profitable. I didn't need anyone's money. And it was a difficult thing to process because all this time everyone was like, oh, you've been doing great, right? But I think the yardstick was different. A week later, I get a call from them, from him particularly, and he said, hey, I'd like to buy 51% of your company. I said, fuck off. I think he knew that we were children, and he saw some potential in me, and he said, look, it's fine. We don't have to engage in this, but why don't we work together as clients, and you can change your mind later. First client we got, the story that I told you. It was one of their portfolio companies in Australia. He said my friends were flying over there to do a video and for us to take over that campaign. I didn't know. I had no reason to say no to that. Jumped on the call, did this whole thing, only to realize the campaign for his friend was literally Bill Gates from the Melinda and Gates Foundation going to one of their properties to assess kind of the productivity of proteins.
So you're 21 years old at this time?
Yeah.
And you get invited to a meeting to meet a friend, and you're in that meeting, and all of a sudden the friend is Bill Gates. Nice.
It's tricky, right? And as someone in Sri Lanka, you don't know how to process that information. We were supposed to quote for that. I don't know how to quote for something like this, so I asked his advice on how do I price this engagement. He told me a number which was usually about 10 times what I was charging in Sri Lanka, and it was about half the workload.
Half the what?
Half the workload.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, we did it, did the work. Everyone was happy. And I decided, oh shit, I can't make these connections myself. I need support. And at that point I decided, I'm happy to have 49% of a much larger pie than having 100% of what I built. I think he knew what he was doing. The trickiest part at that point was convincing my parents that this was a good idea. Because they're like, you have a successful business, you're making money. And when I say I'm making money, we're doing $60,000 a year in revenue. We were not making any real money. And all of a sudden, they got very territorial about it. They're like, why is this random person coming in trying, like, there's no understanding of VC money or any of this and the network effects that it generates. Was slowly able to convince them otherwise. And as you know, very South Asian tradition, you take your parents' advice, right? You don't just randomly go out and do things and kind of make your own path all the time. This is when things got tricky. I went to, they wanted us to meet them. Kind of one of the meetings that I'll never forget. It's the first time I'm traveling alone in Vegas. My parents were incredibly terrified because they didn't know what I was signing up for. I didn't know what I was signing up for. I was supposed to meet this guy. And I was late for a meeting because my SIM provider didn't tell me where I was, and I couldn't figure out the hotel's Wi-Fi changed from wing to wing, and it was just a mess. And I was like 2 minutes late, and he wasn't there. I asked the waiter, it's like, oh, they were there, and they left. And I think that was a really interesting learning because he later told me that the biggest issue for him is time, and he's a bit theatric. But ever since that day, we've never been late for a single meeting. Ended up agreeing to all the terms. I couldn't figure out how to value the business. I told him a number. I said, oh, we're worth anywhere between $500,000 to $1.5 million. And they're like, oh, if you're giving me the option between half and 1.5, I'll take the half. The reason I had it was I had started a bunch of different ideas inside Surge. We had this company that we built called Publisher Rocket. We had this company that we built called Simple Books. Publisher Rocket was built with a friend of mine who I met because I was listening to a podcast called Radical Personal Finance in Australia. I was paying $10 to get into a Facebook group. And in that Facebook group, I met this person called Renee. She has an e-commerce business. And I said, hey, I'm more than happy to help. He said, oh, I actually have a friend of mine in Sri Lanka. Why don't you go ahead and say hi to him? And I was like, oh, I don't want to meet another SEO dude. They're terrible people. Ended up meeting him, a gentleman by the name of Dave Chesson. He was working for the US Embassy at the time. And what ended up happening there was remarkable. We built such a long friendship and a business that is now, incredibly successful. It's worth in the 8-figure range, and I'd say closer to mid 8 figures at this point. And him and I built that business, and it was such a strong friendship. He became my best. He was the best man at my wedding.
Nice.
So all of these kind of business opportunities, and at that point, that business was tiny. Simple Books I had started because I got called up by the tax department in Sri Lanka because I hadn't created employee tax files. I didn't know I was supposed to do that because no one told me that was the right thing to do. And I realized that if I'm going to have this issue, all of my friends that are starting up businesses will have these same issues. So I decided to write a blog post called How to Set Up a Business in Sri Lanka, which gained a ton of traffic. Like I understood the SEO elements of it, right? And we ended up basically, because if anyone tried to read the government's website and do this on your own, it became more complicated and even harder than before. Simple Books today is a corporate secretary to over 9,000 companies, and 1 in 6 companies incorporated in this country is done by Simple Books.
Wow. Sorry, 1 in 6
privately held companies
built in Sri Lanka today have come through the business Simple Books.
Yes. So the 500K to 1.5 million number came because of all of these concepts. And I was starting to build an office for Surge in a piece of land. And they're like, look, we have no interest in any of this stuff. Cut it all out. Let us invest in Surge. I was like, all right, that's fine. I said, okay, 350 grand. When I said 350 grand, I thought that was the market cap of that business. What they thought was 350 grand for 51%. So I accidentally doubled the market cap of the business. And I only figured that out when I got the term sheet at the very end where it said, oh, $351,000. And I was like, all right. And we signed. What became tricky was due diligence. So the way they made the investment was part through their fund, part through a portfolio company, but the portfolio company is a listed entity in ASX. I didn't understand the complexity of dealing with a listed company. They essentially said, oh, we're happy to do it. KPMG will reach out for due diligence. I started this business when I was 90s.
Hey guys, I'm trying out a new ad. It's ASMR. I hope you like it. The Chew the Fat podcast is brought to you by the Eat with Purpose cookbook. It's out now. Do you want to get ripped, eat healthy, and get love with the ladies? Well, it's not the book for you because it's my mission to raise $1 million for children's cancer. Now let's get back to the show.
I had been called to the tax department because I hadn't created employee files and whatnot. I was not ready for a KPMG DD. Every time they asked for a document, I'd push the conversation back and back and back, and it took 3 months for them to actually collect the documents. From that point, DD ran for a year because every time they would ask anything, I would just not have the information. Starting a business, no one really tells you these things. Now, I suppose it's a lot more mature because the entrepreneurship scene is more kind of, there's courses, there's communities, there's all of these stuff. Back then, nothing existing, especially in Sri Lanka, right? So what happened then was they created this document. I still have it with me. It's called Project Emma. They had classified our capabilities and risks into 48 line items. Categorized it as high risk, medium risk, low risk. I had one low risk where I didn't owe any of the employees superannuation because the company was less than 5 years old. I had one medium risk because I had lost the lease agreement with the landlord, and they were like, oh, it's a $1,000 lease, it's fine, you know. The rest were just high risk, high risk, high risk. Employee does not, employer intermingles funds. There is no inventory management. There's no methodology around invoicing. Accounts receivable is not tracked. Accounts payable is not tracked. And it was an absolute disaster. Tavistock got the DD, looked at it and said, you know, why is this lit up like a fucking Christmas tree? And I really didn't have a good answer. But at the same time, the work we were doing with them had been good. So they liked the work. We were good at the marketing work we did, less about the marketing business we were running. And when they decided to invest, they had not seen a single member of the team. They had not looked at any of the operations. It was just a conversation. They said, look, you have 6 months. Get your shit together. If you can, we'll do the deal. If not, we won't. Now, I had a bit of an aha moment there because all this time I didn't really know what I didn't know. And then suddenly KPMG comes and says, here is a blueprint. If you fix these 46 things, you have a good business. So every day we would wake up, look at that blueprint, clear line item by line item. And on 6 months to the dot, we had cleared every single issue, corrected any errors. And the conversation that started in January of 2017 ended in March 30th of 2018, where we signed the deal and got the funds in, and they became a majority investor of Surge.
Boom. What was the, there's a steep transition, right? From running your own race. The reality is you're young, you're making it up as you go through this due diligence process, and all of a sudden, it's kind of like you're a real business now. Mm-hmm. Like, what is that change that you had to go through as a founder that it then helped you kind of get to where you are today?
I think the main thing I learned from having a 51% owner is that you no longer have the right to be stubborn. You can't make unilateral decisions, and you had to manage stakeholders. You had to learn to convince people, and I got really good at it. I think that event was the single best thing that happened to Surge because I just stopped making all my reckless decisions. Everything was strategic, everything was planned, everything was rationalized. I still had ideas, and we sometimes do certain things under the radar, but we did them in a way it doesn't cost the business's P&L any money, right? So it created this framework for validation and governance that I think every business should have at some point. And because we had a listed entity that was part shareholder, we had to operate on the standards of a listed entity, right? The listed entity had a material interest in the company. So we were filing I was filing quarterly reports when I was 23.
This is so wild.
I think that process matured you as an entrepreneur because you understand what the late game is. And then everything you build from that day is geared with that in mind, which I think most founders don't have kind of that experience in, and they learn it the hard way. I think the benefit for me was I got the ability to do the hard part early.
So let's start to fast forward as we grow Surge. Like, what were the the next big material chunks that made that started to really mature the company and put us in the 12-story building we're at today?
I think the biggest issue was, and this was a tough one for me to process. After 2018, 2019, we had got a new CEO. I think it was more of a training wheels exercise for me. But as a founder, you have a fair bit of ego. And to have someone else come in and say, okay, you're reporting to them now, is a bit of a tricky transition.
That's huge. I didn't realize that. How many years post-deal was that?
1.
1 year post-deal?
Yeah.
What did that feel like?
I didn't know. Look, I knew I wasn't mature as an operator at the time, but it's also, this is your baby. I think I got frustrated and annoyed at times because there were situations where I would say things, but the CEO wouldn't agree to those things. And at that point, like, I have no recourse, right? Like, I can't say, no, we're doing this anyway, or I can't take it to the board because I don't control the board. The good thing is she was a remarkable person, Haley. So she was CEO between 19 to 21.
Yes.
1921 and 1922. And I think we became really close friends, which made that transition palatable. I think if it weren't for that, and if we didn't have that mutual respect for each other, I think that would have been tough. So I think I got very, very lucky there. 2019 was also then the year after, was a bit of a tricky year for Sri Lanka. We had a terrorist attack. I was supposed to have a meeting with a potential business partner on Easter Sunday. Meeting was at like 9 or something, and Haley calls me up and said, hey, I need you to send me this P&L. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do it now, like, because I'm also used to never being late. And she's like, look, we need this. This is a report that has to go out. I don't care what you're doing. Take 15 minutes, get out of the car, do this, and then get back. I was getting so late that I asked my dad to drive so I can actually work on the car in case any changes need to be done. The meeting was at the Shangri-La. As I pull in to the Shangri-La, as my dad pulls in the car, you see the front face completely explode. And I have no idea what happened. You see people getting evacuated. I just assumed there had been some generator explosion or something. My dumbass, because was recording it on Instagram, because I had built a bit of a brand on social media at the time, and anyone who knew me through Instagram, because I had this idea that I was going to record everything, because I told people that I'm working 20 hours a day, and people think that you're being like it's all hyperbole. You're not actually working 20 hours a day. And Instagram had this timestamp feature. So I'd have the story every 2 hours. You'd actually be able to track that I've been working 20 hours a day for the last 5 years. And we were escorted outside the back entrance, and I told my dad just to drop me at, there's this hotel called the Cinnamon Grand, which is right next to Shangri-La. I get off at the Cinnamon Grand and start walking inwards. Second explosion, I see a woman's hand flying off.
No way.
I was wearing a white color Nike sweater, which to this day has black stains on it from the explosion. I think that was probably something that changed my perspective a bit.
How?
I think life can be remarkably short. You have no idea what's around the corner, quite literally. It's one of those burnt toast theory moments. If you're familiar, you forget to burn, your toast burns because you were slightly late for something, and you realize that event saved your life. And so I think at that point, kind of Haley saved my life. But I think 200 and something people died that day. And Sri Lanka went through a really rough time. As an economy, Sri Lanka has really had the short end of the stick again and again and again. 2019 recovering was market panic. People couldn't invest in the country. Hospitality and tourism started tanking because you don't want to fly into a country that had these terrorist events. And we had just gotten out of a 30-year civil war like a decade ago. So this was kind of indicating a potential future that we thought was in the past. Running a business in that environment is tricky because every time you have a conversation with a client, they don't understand that that was an insulated incident. They think that that's day to day. So they're like always on edge talking to you, right? And we had just started building like proper relationships. I think towards December, things started to calm down, or so we thought. We had just won a really interesting client, a education business that we've helped with a lot of the enrollment work for. And they were based in Manhattan. The really interesting thing happened was COVID. 2020, everything went into lockdown in January. And they were incredibly kind of displaced. We didn't know what was going on as well because I think no one knew what was going on at the time. And we were trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? Our clients were struggling a lot more than we were. And they had realized that their team in Sri Lanka was significantly more efficient, more productive, because we were working remotely with them anyway. They were trying to go remote, even though we had an office and we are in office. As far as they're concerned, we're remote. I think at one point they said, we should give them more work. At the time, we had managed to spend the last couple of years fixing our leadership, fixing the right team, having the right processes, and we were at this tipping point. We had 30 people in the business, and we were kind of hungry to grow. As COVID rolled over, they said, look, let's do this. And they started increasing the workload quite drastically. And as this client had this inclination, all of our other clients came into the same realization. 2020, we walked out of the office to work remotely with 30 people. 2022, we came back into the office with 300.
Oh, Bhanuka. 2 years from 30 to 300, and you had to do it and scramble remotely.
Yep.
Fucking oath. What did that teach you?
We ended up building an entirely different business to be able to solve that. Hiring is a disorganized mess, especially in parts of the world like Sri Lanka. We don't have the right tools. I said, every time we were really good at social media, so we would create content, we'd run ads, we'd get a ton of CVs in, and then we'd lose it, misplace it, we don't index it properly because it started becoming crazy. People are also getting laid off, so it was the perfect time to hire, right? We were trying to build a tool, and then at one point, Serge said, no, it doesn't make sense, and they were trying to look for stuff off the shelf. I think we were looking at this one tool off the shelf called Greenhouse, and they said, oh, it's something like $20,000 a year starting, plus. And it would, some people were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on this tool. I was like, wait a second, this is a remarkably simple tool. You have PDFs that are CVs, and you just need to move them across a hiring spree, just like you'd run a project management, like a Trello or something like that. And we said, I'm pretty sure we can build it. We put a small team together, created a company called Rooster that helps businesses hire, manage, and retain talent. And we were able to do it at 1/100th the cost. So today, I think that the tool has like 15,000 employees payroll that it manages. We do everything from clock in, clock out, performance management, everything we've been able to kind of bundle in and basically give it to someone at $1. But we kind of built that tool out of necessity because we realized that it's actually insanely complicated and people are super inefficient. So if you look at the South Asian market, when you apply to a job, very few people don't actually respond saying you got rejected. And it's not because they don't want to tell you got rejected. There's so much stuff going on. They don't have the ability to do it. So what we did was, that looks like a simple automation. Just click a button, set up a default template, and drag 30 people, hit send, and it just goes. So the ability to do that completely changed the way that employers saw us. And then it also started building a competitive advantage for us with Surge, because Rooster and Surge are, they're somewhat sister companies. They're not owned by the same people, but essentially what we did was we'd share all the insights. We learned how to run ads. We'd learn how to specifically target for better hiring, how to identify whether they're going to kind of take the job or not. We understood market salary rates. We understood everything. And I think we made a lot of errors in that scaling as well. It wasn't that sunshine and rainbows. I think we probably overhired at one point, which we had to correct later on. And also we started seeing cracks in the organization forming because we started getting bottom heavy. Leadership was not strong enough to handle that kind of change. I mean, we 10x the team size without changing the leadership. And I think that was a bit of a tough time a year or two after that. The tricky part was the year or two after that was an insanely complicated time for Sri Lanka. We had a president that made a set of decisions with COVID. He decided to, before COVID, he decided to remove value-added taxes like GST in Sri Lanka, which accounted for 40% of the country's tax bill. And he did it because he was hopeful that tourism revenues would continuously pick up and it would supplement the subsidization of the VAT. We didn't account for COVID. COVID completely changed those numbers.
Oh, shit.
And rather than saying, hey, look, the thesis no longer makes sense, he doubled down on it. So not even a year, a couple months later, the country ran out of money. We had no fuel in the country because we had no dollars to import anything. And I remember
No fuel, like no petrol and gas and stuff? Okay.
So my dad and I were in different fuel stations trying to get like 10, 20 liters of fuel. And we were in a station for like 2 days. People died on the road.
Sorry. You were waiting at the fuel station for 2 days?
With a laptop and a power bank plugged into the laptop to be able to work while we were there.
It's I've been here for 3 days, Bhanuka. It is really hot. So the people sitting in their car presumably is turned off at this time.
Because they don't have fuel.
And people died.
Yes.
Shit.
And towards the end of it, we started losing power in the country because there's 50% of our power. We have a renewable power source and non-renewables. Non-renewables are petroleum and coal. So like half the day you just don't have power. So imagine running, and it's even worse because the cell towers that operate also started losing power. So your internet connectivity existed and didn't exist. And this ran for like a couple of weeks.
And you had a team of 300 at this time? Fucking hell.
Everyone is out there with power banks. We bought tons of generators and power banks, kind of plugging people into devices so that when things fall down, they can use their backup powers. Everyone was in someone's car, kind of running multiple devices. And essentially we had zero delivery failure, despite literally the country around us breaking down.
You know, I want to pause you for a second, Bhanuka. I think what I was most excited about coming into this conversation, and only more deeply excited about now that we're having the conversation, is, you know, a lot of the entrepreneurs and founders I meet and talk to, including myself, are from Australia. And Australia, there's so much opportunity, and so often, you know, let's be real, often the reason that people don't get after it is purely predicated on their ability to have grit, resilience, and determination. Hearing your journey, your story is like you have all of these headwinds that you have to overcome. And like now these are like really macro uncontrollables, but you've somehow managed to create a controllable through something that I think even myself looking on the outside, I'm like, oh, fuck it. You know, it's incredibly impressive and super inspiring.
At the time, it was terrifying.
Oh yeah.
Because we don't see coming out of it, because until we figure out a way to recover the economy, this is like something that we could be the next Venezuela, right? So you look at the life of people there and you're just on edge, right? Because like, should we actually get out of the country? Why are we staying here? What's the kind of long-term plan? It ended up becoming this thing where people got out on the streets and we chased away the sitting president. It was a historic thing that has never happened in very few parts of the world. Fortunately, the person that came in to take his place made a series of radical tax changes, including, at the time, we were paying zero tax because of the way that he had basically said things like, if you're a technology company, you shouldn't be paying tax. And some things that just didn't make sense. So the new guy, who is not the new guy, the interim president, decided to reinstate value-added taxes, increase income taxes, double down on it, and start to rectify the budget. Things started changing very dramatically, very quickly, because at one point we were on 100% inflation because we had so few dollars in the economy. The rupee went from 200 LKR to 1 USD to 360 in a matter of days, right? And it started affecting the team. And one of the things we did was we were one of the first people to say, hey, look, we're going to start paying you guys in USD because we have the opportunity to do it. In hindsight, it kind of cemented us as one of the leading employers in the country because we are a safe haven against macro risk. At the time, we just did it because it seems criminal to get paid at 360 and then pay out at a 200. I mean, our margins would have like quadrupled overnight, but for all the wrong reasons, right? Like the margin is coming out of the suffering of literally everyone else in the team, and the team is the business. I think operationally, that window was probably the toughest because we had no idea when things would normalize or whether they would normalize. We had no electricity, we had no fuel, and our clients, they're nice to you on your face to say, oh, look, we empathize. But the minute you miss a deliverable, they will look for a different provider because it's a risk to them, right? You guys have decided to hire Surge for what is a critical task for you. If, you'd feel bad if things go to shit, but you would not actually stick around if you need to get your work done. So for us, we were almost downplaying the risks at a certain point to kind of make them feel like, oh, don't worry. And also the media wasn't helping. The media had kind of overblown things into unreasonable proportions, right, as they do. But every single delivery timeline of every single client was met.
What's really interesting, Bhanuka, is whenever a person in their journey gets that opportunity to kind of reflect and talk about the series of events that created the person as well as the business that is today, it's always these big obstacles that we focus on. It's these big highs and the big lows, because fundamentally those are the things that make you. And in those times, it's shit, and I actually can't comprehend how shit that would feel if I'm really honest with you. But those things make you the powerhouse or make you the person that you're fundamentally different to the one you started. And so my question for you is, now that things are, post that start to normalize, like how did that strengthen you as a CEO, as a founder, as well as your business?
I think you learn to build solutions for these risks, right? And most businesses don't really perceive these things as risks because they're not really in normal circumstances. I think you just get more acutely aware about the problems that we could face. And like today, Surge actually looks at their clients and understands the risk profile of the client. What is the default likelihood? What are macro issues that they will have in their country? What are currency issues from a client perspective? We look at all of these things now because we want to build an incredibly resilient business. And we have. Between that time and today, we've kind of still had, we've faced challenges, but we've been able to demonstrate our ability to resolve these things to a point where now governments in foreign countries trust us with infrastructure level responsibilities. I think the journey as a founder is always a tricky one. You're always learning. What you knew yesterday and what you know today are two fundamentally different things. It allows you to kind of start new businesses. It allows you to take on new challenges. And I think it's it's a really interesting experience that once it becomes addictive to a certain extent, right? And you were asking me like why we have so many operations and different businesses and different ideas. I think at this point I see it in the sense of like I want the world to look and feel and work a certain way. If no one else is going to do it for you, you might as well step up and do it.
So share with the audience, like, where are we today? Like, what's the scale of Surge? And one of the things I'd love you to kind of touch on is just like the number of businesses that you're across of and have ownership in. I think it's really interesting. We hear a lot about focus, which for 99% of people is probably really accurate. But what's really interesting to see is you've had this ability to work on multiple things like Rooster. So share where we are right now.
So the businesses that I've started are as a byproduct of my personal problems that I faced. I don't randomly decide, this is an interesting opportunity, I should start a business. The first one was Publisher Rocket, which I have an ownership stake in. Publisher Rocket is, they're the leading analytics software for book publishers. We have over 100,000 paying customers on the system. We have Simple Books, which I started close to about 8-9 years ago because I had to deal with compliance issues and I didn't know how to do it. So we built a system to allow founders to not have that problem anymore. I believe we have about 9,000 companies that rely on us for corporate secretarial work. We're one of the most cheapest, most efficient players in Sri Lanka, and we are just about to launch in Singapore and India. We have probably about 50 people in that team. It also has its own YouTube channel, which is kind of how it drove most of its value, which is it's getting close to 1 million subscribers.
Wow.
We have Rooster, which started off as a system that helped Surge getting through its hiring crisis. Today, they have about 20 people. It's a small team, but we manage the HRIS system, so human resource systems, for over 15,000 employees, so that their payroll, everything is in our systems. About 1,000 people apply for jobs every single day through Rooster. And we just got into a relationship with a financial institution to provide loans based on that data that we have on payroll. And Rooster has customers in at least 50 different countries at this point. And one of the most recent fun ventures that we got into is a company called Scattered Harvest. Agri, which is the exact opposite of anything that I've done, but it's also not.
Agriculture?
Yep. The reason why I thought it was interesting is because with Surge, we realized that if you're not able to, there's a ton of agencies and technology companies around the world. In India, there are millions. In Sri Lanka, there are tens of thousands. We were able to stand out. And the reason we were able to stand out is because we are able to communicate value. We're able to position ourselves. And there's a reason why you chose us to do the work that you did instead of anyone else, right? It's not
because we met on a dining table in Necca.
And the problem with agri, 25% of Sri Lanka's economy depends on it. Like that's where most people work. And they produce things but cannot distribute it to the end customer. What ends up happening is they find a distributor. They make something for $1. Distributor buys it for $1.10 and sells it for 10. That entire value chain is lost to Sri Lanka and it goes to that end consumer. And it just comes through because the middleman understands a few things like how to communicate something better, how to position something better. It felt a little unfair. And I knew that we could do a better job communicating and positioning than most other people. So we decided to get into the space, to build that distribution gap, to then get into our own manufacturing. Today, we have a supply chain where we're involved in the growing, the management, and the selling of fruits and vegetables in Sri Lanka. This year, we're going to move about 240-foot containers of produce from Colombo to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Still a small business, but we'll probably do 2 million in rev. Next year, we'll try to do 7 to 9 with a target to do $100 million in the next 7 years. And we have a very specific way that we want to approach that. That business has investments that it's made in canned beverages, CMOS, seaweed farms, and all of these kind of other verticals, which have value addition capabilities that can improve our gross margins as we kind of scale. Surge is still the crown jewel. Surge is, since 2022, I stepped back in as CEO. And today we've between last year and this year, we've had 100% growth. Between this year and next year, we're expecting to have 100% growth. And today we have about a 400-man team. And the business is not massive. We have 8-figure revenues. I don't know how you'd value it. You would probably argue anywhere that you could value it at 50, you could value it at whatever. But I think Surge has tremendous potential because there is very few businesses that have the experience that we have. Like yesterday, you were able to come into a room to hash out an idea. The idea room consisted of people that have built products before. They're engineers, they're designers, they're marketers, and they're thinking from all different angles to help you say, this is the best iteration of that product. And, we have, from the 400 people, about 200 in marketing, 200 in engineering. The biggest problem with product developers or engineers is that they are very quantitative. You will tell them to build something, they will build it. But the difference with Surge is, as you know the story now, we are at heart a marketing agency. We understand the user journey and the experience a lot more than a dev shop. Because of that, the engineers are fundamentally more qualitative in their approach than a traditional engineering firm. And their efforts also make the marketers more quantitative in their approach rather than being purely qualitative. So you have this really nice interlap between engineering and marketing, which is kind of brought together by really good design. And I think if you're able to solve these three things, you can do anything you want on the internet, right? All products are a combination of product and market. And we are the ones driving the levers of both. We've built systems in Sri Lanka and brand equity in Sri Lanka to the point where we can now do it at scale. The best engineering talent, the 1% of the talent in Sri Lanka, I would argue is, significantly better than most talent you can find in San Francisco. And you're getting someone you'd pay $1 million there for 100 grand here, someone you can pay 500 grand there, 50 grand here. That provides an incredible leverage. And as you've noticed, the cost of living is not so bad. So at that 100 grand, 50 grand price point, the talent that you have is also living a remarkably good life. Like Surge has one of the lowest attrition rates in the industry. They're happy, they're getting paid well, they live a great quality of life, and they're working on really remarkable products globally. I think that creates something really interesting. And to me, being able to kind of unlock that type of value gives founders and businesses around the world like this really great place to operate from. You have all of these cross levels of control, right? Like imagine you're starting a company, you hire 3 people, and 2 of them are bad. You'll never recover from that. If you hire the wrong security guy, you could completely tank your business. What we provide is because you have clusters of teams, everyone looks at each other's projects. So it gets peer reviewed before it goes into production. So someone who is an expert at cybersecurity that you're actually not paying for in your bill is looking at the code before it goes into production. That's not something that you get anywhere else. And I think we've structurally designed the organization to be able to scale both outward and inward, which has built such a remarkable value proposition for the business that it's quite tough to compete with.
I think that's the thing that stood out to me, right, Bhanuka, is when you first start the startup journey, you have to go through those lessons that you've learned, right? Like there's lessons along the way. And when when I look to Serge, I look to you, it's starting from day dot. You have a lot of the discipline that's kind of baked into an organization, whether it be things like cybersecurity that someone has just not thought about because they're trying to get out that product. And I think that's the really interesting, compelling piece. I've got two more questions for you. One of the challenges with a high performer, and I can see that in yourself, is we're looking at what's next, and we're kind of fixated on those next achievements. But we don't often spend the time to kind of reflect. As you think back to everything you've overcome today, what are you most proud of?
I have this really nice picture that I took before we moved into this office on the 11th floor here. It's a picture of my mom and dad checking out the place, and they're looking outside, and I took a picture from the back. I think that is probably the single best feeling I've had in the business. It's not the investment. It's not the fact that, we've built kind of a remarkable operation and 400 people are getting fed. They're the primary breadwinner for their families, and they're kind of supporting thousands of people. It's not the TED Talks or the Forbes 30 under 30. It's that. I think that is truly a feeling that I feel super grateful for, and I don't think many people get to experience that in their life. And I think I would probably nail it to that.
Why?
I think my parents, despite their push for academia, they have done everything right as a parent. I grew up on it's a 2-parent household. I have a sibling. We have a very close personal relationship, and they've supported us in every conceivable way that they can understand. It gets a little tricky on the things that they can't understand, but I don't think that's their fault. I think when you were 5, obviously you get mad at it, but you grow up and you understand. For me to be able to give back to them in a way that I understand, and it's a form of connection that we both kind of get, it's incredibly fulfilling.
I love it. And it's 40 years from today. You're sitting on your couch, you're sipping a tea, maybe something from Scattered Harvest, and you're reflecting on the life that you've had. What's the impact that you've made on the world?
This is a tough one. So my ideas are somewhat lofty, and I think you can call bullshit on it anytime. I don't want to make an impact on the world. I think that's too complicated. I do want to make an impact on the community that I live in and the country that I live in. Because I feel like we don't have enough people that are batting on our side, and I would like that to change. So the idea for me is, if you look at Sri Lanka, it's a very small economy, $80 billion, $85 billion, and we currently have $6 billion in the bank. That's not a lot of money. It's the same amount, you and I have friends that have more cash in their accounts than the entire current balance of this country. I'd like to be able to contribute to it in a meaningful way that other founders and business owners, when they build their next set of businesses, don't have to go through the pains and struggles that we went through. They don't have to worry about terrorist attacks. They don't have to worry about weeks of zero electricity and internet. And I would like to help uplift the overall quality of life. And I don't think I am able to do that through charity and empathizing with everyone. I'm able to do that by helping build a really strong current balance. every business that we do, there's a common theme, which is from Sri Lanka to the world. We're based here, but our revenues are all foreign and they're eventually brought back here. And I think that's a fun goal which benefits everyone. And I think it's so far away and so difficult to do that I can perhaps spend my entire life in pursuit of it, which I think is, it's a nice thing to look back at and go, all right.
This morning I started the day and I watched this Tiger Woods video from way back in the day when he was getting interviewed, and he says to the interviewer, if I keep playing like this for the next 2 days, I'll win. And the interviewer kind of essentially laughed at him, kind of like, oh, you're a bit cocky. And then years later they sit down, watch the interview together, and the interviewer's like squirming because he realizes Tiger Woods, he was talking about that time, was the greatest ever. And so the reason I share that is because, as you tell me, it's quite lofty. You might not believe me. Bhanuka, I will not be as silly as that interviewer. Mate, I believe you. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure.